Let me address this issue of Derek lying about my record. He's lying about my record just like he's lying and trying to fool the voters in this district about his fake family. I mean, if you are going to lie about something as fundamental as your family, you're going to try to portray yourself as a family man so people like you. How can you be trusted on more serious topics? It's unacceptable. And you know why he's doing it? I'll tell you why. Because he wants to distract from the important issues in this race, like abortion, like reproductive freedom.
Eugene Vindman, you're the Democratic nominee for Congress in Virginia's 7th Congressional District. For those who don't have the context, can you explain what just happened at that debate where you went after your opponent for literally faking a family?
Well, look, I like to call the 7th Congressional District the best congressional district in Virginia. So, it's really weird. So you have, when you're a middle-aged MAGA bro without wife and kids, what do? You go out and borrow your friend's wife and 3 daughters. So last weekend, there was a story in the New York Times that came out, and Derek Anderson had apparently borrowed a family. I knew he wasn't married, but he had borrowed a family to, and I think they got this part 100% right. They were talking about Republican candidates around the country that are trying to soften their image with women because of their, frankly, wrong-headed stance on things like reproductive health care and issues that will hurt families. So they enlist female family members. Well, Derek Anderson didn't have a wife and kids, so he went and borrowed them, attempting to appear like he's married. And there are a couple of different shots. There's one where he's standing, very protectively behind a woman and 3 girls and looking paternalistic. Another one where he's sitting at the head of a kitchen table, looking like he's presiding, classic, I guess, MAGA dreams, maybe. So he made a false statement. He made a series of false statements. And at a certain point, I decided to listen, Derek, you're lying about this issue like you're lying about your fake family. And the reason why is because you're trying to distract people from the issues that they care about in this race.
Well, we just showed a graphic of the New York Post headline calling this out. I mean, it seems everybody is having fun with it. It's not funny at the end of the day because of what it says about this candidate who wants to represent Virginia's 7th. But this wasn't an example of your Oppo team digging deep and finding some picture of him with supporters from his campaign. He was using these images. He staged these photos and put them out there as if this was who he was. And you called it out at the debate. The media has picked up on it. And it's important, not because it's a funny example of the extremes MAGA will go to, but this is a character test.
Well, it is. I mean, if you think about it, if you're gonna lie or try to fool voters into believing something you're not, as something as basic as whether you're married and you have kids, what's to say you're not going to lie about more substantive issues like abortion? And he tries to portray himself in a certain light in that regard, protecting women's reproductive health care, if he's actually going to do that or not. And one of the questions I frequently I've asked him during several joint appearances, listen, if one of the most basic questions, one of the most important questions in this race is, are you going to defend women? Are you going to defend women's reproductive health care? It's a health care issue in the form of abortion. And he has dodged and dissembled and every other D word on this topic. He won't answer. He was refusing to answer the question, and he was making false statements. And so I decided to call him out. The other thing is the other main topic we talk about here in this region is Project 2025. he's not being straight on that one either.
It seems like an incredible act of desperation on the part of your opponent, but also on the part of the Republican Party as a whole. They are now tied to Project 2025. They're tied to the deep misogyny that animates their most religiously motivated base members. And they're trying to backtrack. And you see it in this small example of Derek Anderson renting a family. You also see it in larger examples. For example,
I think to be precise, borrowing. I don't think he paid for the family, so it was just, borrowing.
Okay, borrowing a family. You also had Melania Trump out there with this video. We'll roll the clip, claiming to be deeply pro-choice. Here she is.
Individual freedom is a fundamental principle that I safeguard. Without a doubt, there is no room for compromise when it comes to this essential right that all women possess from birth, individual freedom. What does my body, my choice really mean?
Eugene, do you think voters are falling for it, or do we know what the Republican Party truly is, what it's become?
Look, I think voters are going to have a hard time sorting through what is true and what's not true in this election. And this is pretty deep subterfuge, whether it's the Melania video, whether it's just posing with a fake borrowed family. Being straight with voters used to be something that was fundamental to securing their trust. And now it's, fooling voters apparently is the only way some of these folks can get elected. And once they have the power, getting them out of that position is like, trying to dig a tick out. So it is discouraging. It's disgusting, and it's dishonest. It's dishonorable. It's Derek Anderson.
Yeah.
So.
That's a good bumper sticker. I'm not deep into the nuances of the Virginia 7th, but an issue we both care deeply about, and I hope every American will find the mental energy to care deeply about, is Ukraine. I just came back. We did some reporting from there, headed back in January. What's at stake in Ukraine? Why should Americans care?
Well, we actually got into some foreign policy topics during the debate, and Ukraine is one of the most acutest foreign policy challenges that we face. Obviously, they've been at war, large scale war, since February of 22, but they're going on 10 years of war, over 10 years of war, since 2014 when it started in Crimea and in the Donbass. And, they're suffering terrible casualties. They just lost Vuhledar, a town that there had been fighting over for basically the entirety of the war, large scale war. And, at a great cost to the Russians, but the Russians really don't care about losing manpower, material. They don't put much value on that. The Ukrainians obviously put a great deal of value on people.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here to remind everyone, if you haven't yet subscribed to the podcast version of this show, please do. The link is below. And don't forget to rate and review. It makes a huge difference in how the algorithm ranks shows. Thanks for the support.
And so there are humanitarian stakes involved here, terrible suffering in Ukraine, but there's frankly a U.S. national security interest involved. And it's been there for the entirety of the conflict. But at this point, if the Russians end up succeeding in seizing and holding and then forcing the Ukrainians into a temporary peace, it'll be like a snake that digests a portion, at a time. They'll be back. They want all of Ukraine. I don't think Putin has in any way changed his mind or reduced his appetite. And then we have potentially NATO partners that have already talked about putting troops on the ground, whether it's the Netherlands or France, in harm's way, in support roles, not on the front line, but in harm's way in a war zone. And there's a real potential for things to spiral. It's hard for me to imagine that the Poles would be okay with the Russians being right on their doorstep without having another country as a bumper. So there's a potential for this thing to spiral. Other countries are obviously observing the U.S. response and the commitment of the United States and NATO, and China's watching us closely. And there is a sort of an alliance forming, if not a formal alliance, an access, let's say, between countries like Russia and Iran and North Korea and China, which is very dangerous. And my opponent, frankly, in this regard, represents a MAGA wing of his party that would withdraw into ourselves, that would try to sort of become isolationist, like this country was in the 1930s, and it's just not possible these days. If we leave that vacuum, one of our adversaries will step in and will make life a lot more uncomfortable for us.
For sure. Very well said. We just had Tim Snyder on the show talking about the strategic implications of a loss for Ukraine. And I think, and you echo this, the point that he really drove home is that there's just a totally different philosophical mindset between Ukraine and Russia towards the value of life itself. And Ukraine, their values align with ours. And as we saw in Volodar, I was just in Donetsk Oblast, the region close to Volodar. They didn't care how many men they lost taking that small village. The Ukrainians pulled out after they'd held it as long as they could. And if you look at the firepower that the Russians brought to bear in the end, the Ukrainians were right to pull out, because at the end of the day, they care about life in a way that the Russians do not. I love your analogy about the snake grabbing a bite at a time. But I think we also need to acknowledge what would happen in the occupied territories to Ukrainians if we try to compel Zelensky and the Ukrainians to write those areas off. I mean, we talked to people in formerly occupied areas in the past few weeks, and it's a horrific existence, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody.
I was just going to say, this is an area, I've done substantial work in Ukraine in the context of investigating war crimes. And so this is definitely an area that we investigated and started assessing for war crimes, how the Russians are treating Ukrainians in occupied zones. And it is atrocious. We hear stories. I would like to return back to my I guess, MAGA rival. It's interesting, right? So you have in Donald Trump a president that's clearly laid out a desire to become more isolationist and kind of withdraw from parts of the world. And there has not been a member of the Republican Party that has been successfully able to stand up to him. So this idea of there being independent voices in the Republican Party is just complete farce. It's fallacy. And they all vote in lockstep if Donald Trump and the roadmap or the instruction manual that is Project 2025, they'll be implemented, and there's not going to be a member of that party that stands in the way of that.
100%. This is a generational, probably even bigger than that, clash, a civilizational clash. And if Ukraine loses, I think the democratic world is in real peril, especially across Europe. And all you have to do is talk to Russia's neighbors if you want to get a real sense of the threat. Your family, you and Alex and your loved ones have shouldered a pretty enormous burden after you and Alex reported that perfect phone call, which led to the impeachment. How are you guys holding up?
You know, we're still fighting. We're still fighting for democracy, for our values. That's ultimately why I'm doing what I'm doing now and running for Congress, because I want to make sure that I'm pitching in at a local level here in the 7th district, the best district in Virginia, making sure we hold a critical seat. This is going to be a tight election. It's going to be one of the tightest elections in the country, and which is why I encourage all of your viewers to go to VindmanForCongress.com and mash that donate button, because we're continuing to gather the resources that we need to hold the seat. And ultimately, holding the seat is the way we flip the House. Well, just around 30 days left to go. We'll put a link in the show notes. Eugene, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Ken.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.